So, the final ultimate raid of Dawntrail, and the 7th to release in the game's overall life, has been out for a couple of weeks now. A number of cutting-edge groups have gotten the opportunity to progress and defeat it, and I finished it as well after over a week of long hours and painstaking trial and error. I have a lot of thoughts about it, and now that I've had time to sit back and ruminate on the experience and do a couple of reclears, and more than anything, I've been left thinking on how the design showcased here could bleed its way forwards into Evercold and onwards. Is this break from the norm in theming and design the start of an approach we can see continue on? And more importantly, is it fun? How does it hold up to the other previous Ultimates? I'll get to all of it if you just give me a few minutes to yap. Before we get started, if you want to support deep dives and discussions into FF14, please do consider subscribing. It really means a lot. So, firstly, this Ultimate broke tradition completely from those that came before. Traditionally, they'll cycle between fights themed around the main scenario quests or raid series of a particular expansion. Bahamut Coils, the A Realm Reborn Ultima Weapon story arc, Alexander, the Dragonsong War, Omega, and most recently Eden after skipping a Stormblood main story ultimate. Now, instead of getting that or something else Shadowbringers themed, it's Kefka, a boss from the Omega raid series that was beloved but never featured in its respective ultimate. It was a shame to me and many others, so I was excited when it got announced as a full-fledged encounter. I released a prediction video shortly before release in which I mentioned expecting Chaos and Exdeath, the Warring Triad, or even a fourth wall breaking appearance from previous ultimate bosses, dragged into the interdimensional rift by Kefka's powers. We got some of those, but for the most part this encounter truly focuses on the titular character. Phase 1 is Kefka, the same boss we got in the Door Boss Savage variant from 08S. In the original version, his mechanics mostly revolved around mixing elemental attacks with truth and lies, forcing players to occasionally stand in the bad to find the real safe spots amongst the fake danger. In Ultimate, this is true as well. He uses far more complex versions of similar telegraphs, and multiple at once, which can be either truth or lies. Later in the phase, he'll have players drop a sequence of arrow tiles on the floor, which they must then use to teleport players who are inflicted with confusion so that they can't murder the poor other half of the raid who are given sleep instead. The phase goes by quickly, and for us it took a little over an hour to solve and make it through. It's simple enough, fun to execute, and has really interesting tank buster usages. I guess to dive into those a little, in Phase 1 of Kefka there are some aggro-based swap busters, and some multi-hit busters, and both of those are fairly unique in terms of ultimate in one simple category. They do not apply a vulnerability, and as a result you have full control as to how you deal with them. Do you use invuln? Do you swap it normally? Do you have one tank kitchen sink and manipulate the aggro so that they take all of the hits? Having choice is interesting, especially when the hits come in regularly enough that you can't just invuln or kitchen sink every single one. This is a common trait that reoccurs throughout the entire fight: choice. Often in Savage and Ultimate, there are a lot of mechanics that have multiple resolutions with their own upsides and downsides, but also a number that feel like they have one specific way to get through that is just clearly the best and intentional. Even as early as Phase 1, I feel that this isn't true when it comes to Kefka's Ultimate. There are risk-reward choices to every strategic decision, and enough freedom in the toy box to put the pieces in as you wish. That much is clear from the sheer number of different resolution methods we've found over the past couple of weeks for arrows, the purple puddles, and the small optimizations even the initial mechanic a handful of seconds in has received. There's so much more of this as we embark further into the encounter too, and for me personally, it's the kind of design I always want to see have a heavy placement in hard content. Comparing this directly against other first phases, Kefka is a breath of fresh air to me. It combines fast pacing, interesting damage profiles with a lot of tank expression, and some solid variety in the movements and challenges you're tasked with. While I feel some of the individual mechanics aren't as strong as what you can find elsewhere, and yes, By that, I am admitting to being a fan of the Looper spinning plate fiesta at the start of the Omega Protocol, but Kefka just has more there, and it's fun to do. Speaking of fun to do, I suppose now we have to talk about arrows, right? It's interesting because I'm sure this little test has sparked a lot of debate and discussion in the community. At its core, it's simple. Players drop arrows, take them by using confused players who will then try to attack sleepers. You just need a baseline understanding of how to read a clock, a rudimentary strat, and at its core it is simple. But because Final Fantasy XIV's completely valid netcode and design that has zero flaws or hiccups in any way, shape or form, for the first few weeks of release, it was an entirely spotty experience. It was at the point where players could perform everything correctly and run straight through their arrow to punch their teammate in the face. We even had this happen once or twice ourselves, and there are a million clips out there to the same effect. We ended up having to make small alterations and allowances in strats to make it consistent despite that. And whilst it worked, and there was a clear fix that would yield fruit, oversights like this speak once again to the fact that the development team really need to be more cognizant of just how their game operates on a non-zero ping environment. Really cool idea, but the implementation should be good from the get-go and not 3 weeks later after hotfix. You move on to Phase 2 against God Kefka, again also represented in Savage as the other half of the original fight. Forsaken is the main mechanic here. In fact, it takes up near enough 80% of the runtime of this phase. That makes sense, because this mechanic is absolutely bloody insane. It asks a lot of you, it offers so much choice, and it basically lets the party loose in a put the square in the square hole type of challenge, where they can dictate when and where those squares go in amongst the chaos, as long as, once again, they do eventually go in. Basically, you're going to get these 8 sets of 2 towers back to back, and players will be marked by simple stacks, spreads, or cleaves, which must be baited by somebody else, the closest player to the person with the cleave. Standing in a tower as it resolves with one of these will execute the mechanic, cleansing a stack of the debuff. You need to cleanse all of the debuff stacks before the end, which ends up resulting in you aiming to deal with 2 mechanics per tower, and you can handle this however you want really, leading to an insane level of choice and diversity in strat that can eventually work. If everybody was comfortable enough, you could arguably just wing it and see positive results. But for anybody progging, this is entirely unrealistic. It deals high damage, is quite timing intensive, and diverts your attention by throwing front and back cleaves in between sets to make the memory game and positioning feel even more stressful. I would go as far as to say that this is one of, if not the hardest mechanic to strategize around and then execute in FF14 history. The reason it didn't take so long to prog though is twofold. It's early in the fight, and failing it doesn't immediately spell a wipe, so with enough mitigation, as well as a well-placed healer LB3, you can get good practice regularly. There's a trend throughout this ultimate when we compare it to Top and DSR. There are far more mechanics that will allow you to practice after failure, and that exponentially decreases progression time despite how challenging some of the elements actually are. If you make it through Forsaken in one piece, there's a very simple Trine dodge comboed with 2 back-to-back tank busters, and the phase ends. If you kill Kefka, you get a victory screen, and the fight is over. Except, it isn't. This is a failure state, and if you find yourself falling into it, your only recourse is to leave the instance and try all over again. This is how it went for most cutting-edge groups. We'd clear phase 2, realise we'd done it all wrong and that there was a puzzle element. Luckily, this one was simple to solve. In phase 1, there are a couple of mechanics that are just a bit strange, they don't add up. And we noticed that during prog even, but decided to ignore it for the short term. In phase 1, there are a couple of debuffs that drop and do nothing, puddles that behave in a very suspect way, and the arrows that simply don't require you to interact with half of their tiles to effectively make it through. Kefka has set up a slew of mechanics that you need to either excel at or solve in ways that wouldn't be obvious. He wants you to mess around with the game, and only when you've done so can you move through and defeat phase 2 which now gives a cutscene instead of a fake victory screen. My initial expectation had been that this would be a recurring theme, that each phase would have a couple of components we'd need to handle quote-unquote wrong or in a weird way, building up to this entire timeline across the battle of non-linear progression, just like we see in Ultima Weapon Ultimate. But that isn't really the case. This is one and done. For me personally, I do feel it made for a really interesting Day 1 and Day 2 playing experience, and I expect it was exciting for viewers too, but I was a bit disappointed that the spectacle and hijinks seemed to just end then and there. I would have liked more of it, and I feel a little taken aback that this experience was so fleeting when the broader encounter could have benefited from it. This is in part due to my own expectations rather than any failure on Square Enix's part. I think for me, the overarching puzzle and spectacle of an Ultimate is part of what makes it exciting both for me as a player, but also for the people watching along. Something that everybody witnesses or solves together and is made bigger by the fact it isn't simply an in-game execution. It brings everybody together, it makes it a moment, a memory. Whilst Dancing Mad did include this early on, I didn't want it to taper off so quickly. Maybe this is a design philosophy that I just need to get used to though. In the cutscene, Kefka breaks the fourth wall and talks directly to the player, promising a real spectacle before lounging around and summoning Chaos and Exdeath from the interdimensional rift. The next phase is a duo fight against both bosses, opening with what feels to be a classic archetypal FF14 trio mechanic in this Elements puzzle. Every player will get these knockback debuffs, which they need to cleanse by being hit by knockback attacks. Every time you remove one, the wind crystal on the arena will pulse, catching onto the nearest player and dealing big damage that is supposed to be soaked in pairs or even more. You're supposed to cleanse fire and water in order based on the debuff durations, whilst using the leftover players to soak the winds that follow, and doing this over time will remove half of the knockback debuffs that players have. At the end, when Exdeath does a huge knockback, the remaining 4 players with the debuffs will proc theirs, and the 8 players will mobilize together to soak them safely in pairs. What you're seeing here is the intended resolution. There's a lot of freedom in positioning and precise timings in Bowels of Agony, and so you've likely seen every early group do something slightly different from one another. Another choice-driven mechanic, which most importantly also factors in very essential boss positioning for the 2 tanks to handle, keeping the party safe from cleaves and thunder AoEs. But all of this is likely foreign to most players that have been in or even cleared the encounter today, because there is a huge cheese for this first trio-style mechanic using Tank Limit Break 3, which reduces it to little more than an EX trial challenge. You don't deal with the winds at all, handle only the bare minimum of the fire and water debuffs to not cause a wipe state, and then you tank LB3 the excess of knockback debuffs remaining because the wind vulnerability that one would assume would cause failure doesn't do enough damage to be of any real concern with that level of mitigation. I expect there's going to be a lot of debate about the use of Limit Break to cheese mechanics in a new Ultimate, so I'm going to talk about it quickly. This has happened in the past. UCOB with Grand Octet, for example, though this wasn't really something done on patch due to the sheer number requirements compared to player ability to get through the subsequent ad phase's DPS check. For me, it's actually kind of interesting. You make a sacrifice to your damage in either this phase or in phase 2, or to your ability to recover should things go wrong, in exchange for removing the need to learn how to deal with Bowels of Agony. You make a decision, which has both risk and reward, and that's something I like, and I think groups using this advantage isn't something that should be looked down upon or judged in some way. In fact, we did reprog for a friend recently and we used the strat then. For me personally, I'm glad we didn't figure that out whilst progressing ourselves, and I've had fun learning and doing the mechanic because that's what brings me fulfillment. I don't think it's necessarily going to be patched, but I am fairly strongly of the opinion that this was an oversight and not intentional in any way. Curious to see what happens there actually, though I expect the answer is nothing at all. There's a new limit cut afterwards, and whilst mechanically it's very simple and doesn't really bear talking about, what is a highlight is the fact that it feels almost overwhelmingly quick if you're not used to the first mechanic. It telegraphs during bouts of agony, whilst you're busy with other things entirely, and intentionally splits your focus during the all-important knockback and wins to make you figure out where the limit cut attacks will be coming from. This ultimate very intentionally does that multiple times actually. It repeatedly forces you to split your attention from a singular problem at hand into dealing with what's coming next as well. Sometimes it'll be with raid wides during a memory game that are intense enough to need careful mitigation. At others, it is spot healing a single target during stressful moments. And here, it's needing to track the telegraph of the next mechanic before the first one has even finished. One thing that's really important and interesting to note is that all of this phase, what has come and what is yet to come, is uptime. Both bosses are targetable, and sometimes you can only hit one due to firewall, but others you can cleave on both, presenting the same interesting optimization opportunities that fights like the Extremes offered. Different jobs are able to shine, and more than that, different compositions that include the ability to drop uptime more easily. Jobs like Red Mage and Viper as well gain a lot of value in these cleave situations. The arena is huge. The boss hitboxes, whilst respectable, mean that full uptime is just not always on the table easily, and I think that this style of design is something I've desperately wanted from Ultimate for so long. A long-standing criticism is that whenever a trio-style mechanic happens, the boss leaves, you do the mechanic, and then it comes back. You hit the boss for like 30 seconds whilst it does a raid wide or a tank buster, or in the shock of the century both, and then you rinse, repeat. This style of design shows far more skill expression and is to me way more fun to play. Black Hole is the last major mechanic of the phase, taking up literally half of its runtime. This one is absolutely mad until you form a really solid strategy that can remove a lot of the positioning RNG, and for my group at least, building a strat for this was the biggest hurdle to our prog. You can wing almost everything in it honestly, assuming everybody plays out of their mind in every attempt, but you won't do that because it's dumb to. So it focuses around these debuffs that players receive. Put simply, black holes will spawn with tethers that will shoot beams. Get shot by 3 beams, no more and no less, to proc your Beyond Death and transform your debuff into its success state, and do so before the timer hits 0. What results from this is a really fun little baton passing marathon of mechanic as you swap tethers and locate new ones amongst the party in what feels like a constantly active varied phase. The entire time Kefka is hanging off the edge of the arena, giant in size, mocking you, occasionally slamming his fists or entire body on the arena in an attempt to disrupt you. Interestingly enough, this is where the main challenge comes from, being able to cleanly segment each black hole cycle in your mind from the stacks and spreads and dodges that come in between. Late in the phase especially, there's this one moment with a white hole into lat or long from Chaos and a left-right side cleave from Big Kefka that is followed by stacks or rolls, and this can turn into an unmitigated nightmare almost immediately if boss facing and positioning aren't handled perfectly, as well as if the healers aren't on point. Everything it asks you to do is simple, but it's here that the level of choice you're afforded can quickly become your Achilles heel. With so much freedom, it's all too easy to put your teammates in a bad situation if you position poorly, by letting your beam go haywire or making your tether too close or difficult to swap. Tanks can easily misangle Chaos, causing cleaves to become an insurmountable hurdle. There are proximity tank busters, and single target healing requirements, and pulsing damage every time a major mechanic goes off, and this morphs a sequence of simple extreme trial mechanics into a real test of your ability to hold it all together and ensure you stay regimented, even when it's all too easy to relax. Honestly, this mechanic in particular is one of the most interesting healing exercises in the game as well. Numerous checks when you need to fully heal players or the party, a bunch of tank busters that can't just be invulned or handled with kitchen sink based on their awkward timings, and regular instances of damage that affect both the party but also random targets, dropping them to 1 HP and requiring them to get a solid boost to their health in the next handful of seconds. It really teaches you to get a good understanding of the amount of incoming damage, to prioritize your targets and to use your resources well, knowing that you need to conserve some of them for the next set. Honestly, this is exactly what I've been asking for in regards to healing for a long time, both from black holes and on a broader level from the way that Dancing Mad Ultimate throws damage at you. This fight is really fun to heal. Even back in Forsaken, where the regular attacks deal enough damage to force a careful mitigation lineup over an extended period. And once again, you can hit your respective enemies the entire time. What could have been so easily a standard trio style phase feels utterly unique and stressful, and somehow manages to do so without pulling too intensely from its predecessors or without using some crazy new gimmick we could never have comprehended. It just makes the normal feel fresh, and in a really great way. I would go as far as to say that Black Hole is one of my favourite ultimate mechanics, period. After this comes Kefka Says. This is Phase 4. The clown returns to his standard targetable form, and Chaos as well as Neo Exdeath hang off the edge of the arena like hired goons. This is the culmination of the truth and lie test that has been at the core of Kefka's shtick in Final Fantasy XIV, since all the way back in Stormblood. This entire phase, which lies at around 2 minutes in length, is taken up by this one single mechanic. He'll telegraph true and lie AoEs from Phase 1 and spam heavy raid wides. These are easy to deal with, but split your focus. Then, Chaos and Neo Exdeath will take it in turns to throw debuffs at the party, though these debuffs could be either true or fake. Some will be acceleration bomb stillnesses, though a lie then makes the movement. Some are water stacks or lightning spreads, which can then invert via truth and lie. There are gazes, which can change into look towards, and donut and point blank AoEs, which again can invert. All of this is capped off by Beyond Deaths or Allegan Fields and colours. Some of these mechanics you'll need to remember for upwards of a minute, including whether it's true or false, and how you'll need to deal with it when its timer eventually hits 0. Everything it asks of you realistically is trivial. Stillness, motion, stack or spread, middle or away, stuff like that, it's easy. But through the lens of a huge multi-layered collective memory game, over 11 minutes into the encounter, where one single mistake can be the difference maker between seeing final phase or not, suddenly, I believe it becomes more of a pressure check than even the final phase itself. It's stressful, and it wasn't until reclears that I stopped feeling stressed during that phase. I think the part of it that's the most devious is that during the entire section of these debuffs resolving one after another, Kefka will challenge more real and fake thunder lines and ice cones, and at the end, right before his enrage, he'll show another real or fake icon for each. You'll need to have remembered whether the early iterations were real or fake, and now these real or fake lines and cones will be twisted by the new real and fake telegraphs, and you'll have to find the eventual outcome of that. So you might get a fake, which becomes a real, things like that. In amongst everything, it's a bit of a mind bender, and a real test of how proficient you've become at digesting the rest of the phase. At the end of all of this, you'll fight Kefka again in Phase 5, his new form, the one teased heavily before the Ultimate released. This final phase is kind of interesting, honestly. It has a lot of mechanical variety, roll-based auto-attacks which are punishing tank busters on the tanks, Exalines to be dodged as a party, a new iteration of Exaflares that looks incredibly scary but is fairly comfortable to actually deal with, a debuff-based Celestiad tower mechanic, and Maddening Orchestra, which in reality is a glorified spread mechanic with an additional tank component that everybody just uses invuln to loosen the load of. At the end is a sequence titled, just like the Phase 2 mechanic, Forsaken, where black holes will spawn as the party dodges around them, dealing heavy incoming damage. If you touch one of these black holes, you'll be sucked in and removed from existence, dead, unable to be raised, only able to sit and watch as the rest of your party fights onwards towards the end. Win, and the clear is yours. Lose, and you'll need to fight through the entire 18 minutes all over again. Now, I want to talk about some things. Firstly, where on earth were the Kefka heads? I thought some kind of inclusion would be a given. An interesting challenge of kiting them around in amongst other components, and yet they just don't exist. It feels a little bit weird, and I would say outright disappointing to not feature them. considering they're part of what makes the original 08S god Kefka so memorable. Secondly, there are no relevant DPS checks, and for the most part, I think this is actually quite good. It's clear that this fight has been designed with two things in mind: freedom of strategy adjustments in a more open design space, with uptime being more optional and messiness being the key, and secondly, with a free-form flow to the usage of your 2-minute burst. It could even be a precursor to how we see evolved mode jobs play and battles to be designed around them. There are multiple different ways you can handle your burst windows in this fight, in tandem with Limit Break, to still meet all the checks comfortably. Usually I'd like there to be at least one fairly strict check at some point in a phase, but if this is how fights will be designed in the future, I'm actually okay with it. I also want to once again really laud just how well I think Dancing Mad is designed when it comes to support players, with both healers and tanks getting a different experience with unique challenges that force them to truly understand their class mechanics. It isn't as simple as do mechanics, do damage, and do some healing or mitigation. You need to understand boss positioning, spacing your cooldowns carefully, and as a healer, you need to have a great grasp on all your tools to make it through safely. The worry I have with all of this is that I feel that DPS players will look back on this ultimate very differently than supports will. As a green player, I feel this is up there with the best in terms of encounters. As a DPS, I might feel that it's just good, or maybe even okay instead, middling. I'd be curious to see what people thought about the fight and what they played on their first clear, or their progression in the comments section actually. One thing I'm really not sure about here is the prevalence macros will likely have. We've had memory mechanics before, yes, and even recently with Idyllic Dream, which can ask a lot of a player in regards to their short-term recall. But here, there are multiple cases where you're expected to remember important information for upwards of a minute in stressful situations, and if you mess up, it causes an automatic group wipe, both in Forsaken with certain strategies including the one my group used, and in Phase 4 especially, and I've seen a growing prevalence in an absurd number of different permutations of a limit cut macro going around for Phase 3 to help assist players in where they need to go. With ever higher expectations for the player in order to succeed at mechanics, it feels almost like an arms race in a way to find efficient methods of dealing with it. I do somewhat worry that if this arm race continues, the ramifications it might have for Party Finder's solution to that burden may be something I don't really want to see. Dancing Mad Ultimate is difficult without relying overly hard on body checks, DPS requirements, or strict dance style mechanics, with only one possible outcome. It's freeform, and takes the design style that Dawntrail has done so successfully in prioritizing intuition, understandability, and speed over complexity, while still delivering a far more satisfying challenge than the earlier Ultimate, and yes, I'm talking about Futures Rewritten here, could ever hope to. It includes mechanics like Forsaken, true tests that don't hold back at all. Less downtime, more understandability without reducing challenge, and this really good element that allows you to learn a phase even after failing, thanks to the prevalence of damage downs being the main failure state over instant wipes. Those instant wipes still exist, but they are a bit less common. It feels fun to execute. It's hard, and it really was a joy to progress. I really do think it was a solid effort, and whilst to me, it has some weaknesses in spectacle and in some gaping strange omissions, it's still probably my third favourite Ultimate. It leaves me excited for what's to come in patch 8.1, assuming we do indeed receive another Ultimate then as well. With that said, I expect it will be controversial, honestly. It's different, and it doesn't hit as hard as Dragon Song's Reprise does for me, and I'm sure that sentiment is something many others will feel as well. So like I said, it does so much right, but it's still difficult to ignore the wrong.